You're in session 3, panel 1. I hope that's where you're meant to be. The general topic of this panel is mysticism, global conflicts, and peaceful coexistence. Your program might tell you that the moderator is David Hill. I am not David Hill, I'm Tom Donlin-Smith, but that makes a little difference, does it? So our first, we're going to have 3 speakers, and presenters would ask you to go for about 20 minutes would be the ideal. At the 20-minute mark, I will break in, interrupt as gracefully as I can, and ask you to bring it to a quick conclusion if you have not at the 20-minute mark. And so we'll hear from our 3 presenters, and then we should have plenty of time for some conversation afterward. The first of our 3 presentations is by Dr. Jeffrey Lidke from Berry College in Rome, Georgia. His topic is Looking Eastward for the Kingdom, Comparative Reflections on the Potential of Mystical Practice for Neutralizing Global Conflicts. Professor Lidke, go right ahead. You might need to unmute.
Right, my apologies.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's an honor to present at this conference. Just a quick plug. I wish more of you could hear this. We're doing an opportunity hire in Islam at Berry College. So if any of you know an Islamicist interested in comparative and interfaith work, please let me know. Okay, I will dive in. So I start with Nicholas Roerch's famous painting, The Song of Shambhala, because it evokes into the essence of what I mean to look eastward. In part, I'm fascinated with the history of the Western gaze towards the East in pursuit of mystical wisdom, particularly a place known as Shambhala, associated also with Shangri-La, and it just generally kind of reflective of a human interest in a utopian society, one in which beings live in a state of virtuous harmony. And there is an antidote to the sins and sufferings of human existence, an antidote, I should add, that is kind of recognized to be grounded in science, a history which is perhaps partly what I'm suggesting here, the history that is peaking in the collaboration of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with Western scientists and interfaith leaders. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of his core practices is the Kala Chakra initiation, which is about the realization of Shambhala as a kind of global reality. What I'd like to suggest, kind of just simply and hopefully, is that if we were as a society to fulfill the suggestion of the Dalai Lama that we educate all of our children in the contemplative arts, we could bring about a state of profound transformation. One in which perhaps the narrative of Shambhala would be realized. Okay, so moving through these ideas, I start with Karl von Eckartshausen, who writes in the mid-18th century, The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary, itself a reference to other great mystical texts like The Cloud of Unknowing or The Ascent of Mount Carmel. This is a text that drew interest from Madame Blavatsky and other members of the Theosophical Society, whose core symbol here with all of its kind of eclectic mystical themes. Particularly, I want to highlight and have you note the swastika, which is under the syllable Om at the top of the image. I'll come back to it. Here, Madame Blavatsky in the manuscript series number 36 refers to the Great White Brotherhood. This an interest with the Great White Brotherhood goes back to the cloud upon the sanctuary and the writings of Karl von Eckhart-Schauschen. And it reflects this belief that in the mystical land of Mongolia, Tibet, there is this brotherhood of beings who have the clear intelligence and the power over the visible and the invisible worlds. There's a fascinating kind of literary history that we can trace back through the cloud upon the sanctuary. It's a history that includes the writings of the great theosophists like Madame Blavatsky, also Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who in her The Great White Brotherhood in the Culture and History of Religion in America, kind of maps out what she understands is this deep, profound connection between the East and the West and the wisdom of the Great Brotherhood, which in paintings, we see folks who look very kind of Western, although a bit universal. And again, in that kind of depiction, I would point to this kind of theme from my presentation, that the East and the West are deeply interwoven with each other, and that this Song of Shambhala narrative is about the kind of the East and the West harnessing the fullest potential of kind of mystical technologies. Now, there is a dark side very much to this history. For example, Gleb Bhoki, who was executed in 1937, he was a Bolshevik leader, and he, like other Westerners, came to believe that the doorway to Shambhala was the Beluga Mountains in Russia, and he passed through them, and he was seeking, and in fact set up secret labs to discover the genetics for producing perfect humans, perfect communist humans. This was born out of this kind of mystical narrative of this idea of perfection. So what exactly is perfection? Boki was not the only Westerner. Alexandra David Neal, a famous artist and visionary, traveled to Tibet, met His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. Of course, as we continue kind of narrative on the dark side, Hitler was very much aware of the esoteric cultish writings on Shambhala and other traditions of Asia. And he co-opted one of the most prominent mystical symbols of Asia, and that is the swastika, and made it a part of the symbol for his dark agenda to create a perfect race. So the swastika is, for me, a powerful symbol of what I understand to be the dyadic nature of mysticism, what Foreman might call the dualistic mystical state. The swastika has a clockwise and a counterclockwise form. The clockwise form represents creation, outward expression, literally the opening of the eyes and the activity of the senses as they engage with the world, which is understood to mirror the way in which God opens his eyes and projects the world and becomes the world in Hindu theology. Whereas the counterclockwise swastika represents the turning inward, the becoming still through quiescent contemplative practice. And these two are understood to be in intimate harmony with each other. And from a historical perspective, it is as if the encounter with the traditions of Shambhala in the West kind of first brought on one aspect of the swastika, or one dimension, because the turning inward is also a symbol for death, because in dying we return to ourselves, and also death is a symbol for mystical transformation, a bit like the idea of the dark night of the soul. So I see now in the 21st century the possibility of the kind of fulfillment of the kind of what we might say is of the positive aspects of this encounter with the Shambhala tradition. So here again, we see the image of the swastika on the Buddha, both a counterclockwise and a clockwise pattern. And we are reminded that while Hitler adopted the Sanskrit term Arya to refer to this ideal race, many hundreds of years earlier, Siddhartha Gautama, paradigm of mystical practice in India, used that term to refer to his noble eightfold path, a path that he himself had learned through the study of yoga. In the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, whose origins are about the time of Siddhartha Gautama or the Buddha, some 2,500 years ago, we have the 8 limbs of yoga mapped out. And the first of these limbs is yama, which has to do with ethics. And the Patanjali Yoga Sutra is about a full system of health and practice grounded in ethics that leads to the mystical state known as samadhi. Now, the Buddhists of Tibet believe that before he died, Siddhartha Gautama taught the Parama Adi Buddha Tantra, the primordial supreme Buddha Tantra, which is the root scripture of the Kala Chakra initiation. And the Kala Chakra initiation is the initiation which reveals the wisdom of Shambhala. And this is an image of the cover of the Paramadi Buddha Tantra. So it's believed that the Buddha passed this wisdom on to Manjushri Kirti, who became the first king of Shambhala about 2,000 years ago. And indeed, the Paramadi Buddha Tantra tradition is preserved in Tibet. And it's believed that this tradition will be fulfilled with the coming of Maitreya, the future Buddha, who is depicted here. At the heart of this initiation is the visualization of the mandala as the palace. There's so much we could talk about in terms of mystical architecture and the way in which external architectural structures then become the focus for contemplative mystical practice. In this case, the image represented is the Tibetan monastery, the most important of which is the Potala in Lhasa. And this is a photo of Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army marching in front of the Potala in Lhasa in about 1951. This is the time that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was forced to exile. Previously, inside of the Potala, he engaged in 2 primary practices: inward contemplative practice known as shamatha vipassana, as depicted here, and the preservation of the Kala Chakra initiation, the mandala for which is shown here. After his exodus, the Dalai Lama has brought these practices out into the world with the primary message and challenge to interfaith collaborators and scientists that we should use the power of science to prove that contemplative practice is transformational. And so he's invited scientists to realize that the kind of rich and profound, complex depth of the brain has something to do with the transformation and the awakening of the spirit, that the brain is connected to the heart, for example, through the vagus nerve, and that contemplative practices make possible virtuous transformation. Now, my own work, I've looked at the connections between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, and the way in which a kind of full-blown mystical practice is both contemplative and active, and how I believe the combination of those two has to do with maximizing the potential of the autonomic nervous system. In this regard, I was originally inspired by Charles Foster's thesis that we are wired for God. And I do indeed think the Dalai Lama is sharing a similar message, a message that is grounded in the teachings of yoga, which are at once Buddhist and Hindu. So as we look at these ancient or these paintings of yogic understandings of the body, the gist of what they're trying to say is that the body is connected to consciousness, is connected to spirit. When we harness the potential of the body, we transform ourselves. So now you have this tradition, and it's been going on for at least 30 years, where scientists are testing monks and spiritual practitioners with various technologies to see what is happening when we engage in mystical practice. And a kind of fundamental emphasis here is what's part of what's happening is we're becoming more interconnected, pro-social, positive emotions and qualities are arising, that these practices do something for us neurologically, and they cultivate positive emotional states, making us better people. So when we look at a symbol like this of the Buddha in his state of awakening, we come to understand that the representation here of a top knot is not just simply his hair being woven on the top of his head, but the flame that's coming out here at the top is to suggest some kind of neurological evolution and awakening. And so what the Dalai Lama, who I'm suggesting, is a kind of living representative of the authentic Shambhala tradition, wants us to think about is what percentage of our brain do we typically use? How interconnected are our neurological networks? And to come back to his quote, he has claimed that if we were to educate all the children in kind of mindfulness, mystical practice, violence could be eradicated in a generation. So to wrap up here, the question, can this be done? And here I look to Curtis Paul DeYoung's Living Faith, in which he talks about the idea of the mystic activist. And I add to that the idea of mystics as educators in all of their respective cultural traditions. I'm inspired also by J.C. Pierce's work, The Magical Child. The Magical Child returns the biology of transcendence, in which he talks about how mystical traditions are meant to fulfill the complete maturation of a child's neurological system. And I think about the fact that contemplative practice, mystical practice, is at once East and Western. It belongs to all. So it's not just Eastern children that can be taught to meditate, but Western. And we don't just have to focus on meditation. Other great mystical traditions like Sufis and the tradition of Zikr, which includes the whirling dervish tradition, remind us that contemplative practice can be active and dancing. And we have martial arts. We have sweat lodge traditions. Athletics can be understood as a context in which you cultivate mindfulness, awareness, understanding the flow and the zone states, and of course, ethics and virtue associated with it. So as I kind of wrap this up now, tried to contextualize this brief exploration, thinking about what has it meant for the West to be fascinated with the tradition of Shambhala in the East, and the fact that the Dalai Lama himself is a modern representative of that tradition, believed by his people to be the Buddha of compassion, and therefore truly an ascended master who's been teaching the Kala Chakra tradition, a tradition that he believes is grounded in mysticism, and grounded in science, the heart of which is mindfulness or meditation practice, the benefits of which he claims can be proven by science. He also claims that the essence of contemplative practice is in fact found in other traditions, and he has argued that it doesn't have to be Buddhist. It can be Christian, it can be Muslim, it can be Jewish, it can be Native American, whatever it is. These traditions have been cultivated around the world, and they can even be transformed into secular forms and can take many aspects as I have suggested. And so for me, somewhat hopefully, I mean, I'm fascinated with the history of Shambhala, and I can think about it as a scholar, but also as a practitioner and as a father, and as someone who wishes to be a grandfather who can watch his grandchildren enjoy this world. I think about seriously the message of the Dalai Lama, who's so deeply grounded in his own esoteric tradition, which he practices on average 4 hours a day, beginning around 4 a.m. That something very powerful would happen if the mystics of the world were actually to educate children and kind of bring about a generational transformation. And I think that this generational transformation, I would like to believe that what we've been seeking in the East through these various means is a kind of wisdom by which this place that we find ourselves now becomes for us the Shambhala. And indeed, that is understood as kind of the final message of the Kala Chakra Tantra initiation, the transformation of the place in which you dwell now as Shambhala. And that's something that I believe everyone has to take responsibility for creating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lidke. Not only interesting, but punctual. Thank you as a moderator. Thank you for your timeliness. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We're going to go a little out of order here and go to who might be on your program, the third speaker. We're going to go to Dr. Marinus Iwuchukwu from Duquesne University, speaking on models for ideal and effective interreligious dialogue in mystical religious societies. And there he is.
Thank you all. I have to cue my PowerPoint. I wasn't expecting to go next.
Yes, I'm sorry, I took you by surprise.
Yeah,
take your time.
It's okay. Oh, I got it. Okay. Screen sharing is okay. Can you guys see it? Huh?
Yes, good, thank you.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I modified the title of this presentation of this paper. What you have, there's a little slight modification on it, and the new title is Mystics and Inclusive Religious Pluralism Mindset, Models for Ideal and Effective Interreligious Dialogue in Multi-Religious Societies. My focus in this presentation is to highlight the fact that in our troubled world, in our multi-religious complex societies today, an ideal mindset for effective interreligious dialogue and interreligious relations, which we so dearly need, will be cultivated by the mindset of inclusive religious pluralism. So much of what I'm going to do here is to expatiate on what inclusive religious pluralism is. And I'm taking cue from Jacques Dupuy, who actually initiated, who set these ideas in motion. But beyond that, because Jacques Dupuy did it from a Christian theological perspective, what I try to do here is to highlight the fact that the same theological principle can be applied in other world religions. And for this paper, I am going to briefly talk about mystics from 4 different religious traditions and how these mystics are kind of ideal models of inclusive religious mindset and whose approach to religious differences or the religious other will help us pretty much very well in advancing interreligious dialogue. And I said this paper based on this outline. My bigger focus would be on the introduction and the summary of Jacques Dupuis' inclusive religious pluralism. I just wanted to highlight the fact that these mystics and many other mystics are very good examples for us as people we can emulate. We emulate them already. We can use them as models for effective interreligious dialogue. Mystics, by any standard of definition, are understood as men and women of deep spiritual commitment, which puts them in the category of the truly enlightened people of Richard Roy. According to Richard Roy, truly enlightened people see oneness because they look out for oneness instead of labeling everything as superior and inferior, in or out. They typically don't go into the binary mentality. So this mindset captures the understanding of mystics, especially those I'm familiar with. This morning, somebody highlighted Bernard of Clairvaux. I know he's a saint of the Catholic Church, but I would be very reluctant to see Bernard as a mystic to be emulated, at least not for this purpose. Most mystics I've read about are known to have special respect and appreciation of the different religious traditions they encounter. This respect and appreciation of the authenticity of the religion of the other, which is typical of mystics, arises from the understanding among mystics that the ultimate reality of existence is one, whether it be called the cosmic absolute, God, Nirvana, Brahma, or whatever we choose to call this being, and that all that exists apart from this one is secondary to this one. For mystics, religion is a tool that facilitates access to the one or ultimate reality. Religion appears to be an end for some followers, but should not be, especially for all who search for union with the ultimate reality. Oh, I'm sorry, it's moving backwards. In a competitive world where the fundamental ground rule is underscored by the search for winners over losers, religions have unfortunately fallen into the trap and the marketing gimmick of competition. True religion is not meant to foster our kind of capitalist competition, because such competition sadly promotes what Richard Roy calls striving to be superior instead of deeply connected, seeking ever-changing circle of union. In the Christian tradition, the mission to evangelize on the mandate of Christ was initially predicated on the goal of bringing the good news to all humans, not necessarily to create groups of winners versus losers. St. Paul strongly reminds those who were disputing leadership in the Corinthian community by saying, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel." Corinthians chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17. It was also his way to emphasize to them his preference for sharing the good news over merely boosting the numeric strength of the Christian community. Mystics generally focus not only on seeking union with the divine or ultimate reality, but also advocating same to their admirers or followers. Consistent with their single desire for true enlightenment, mystics are capable of harnessing the values of different religions and appreciating the values obtainable in different religions as they improve on the quality of their own lives. Francis of Assisi, after meeting with Sultan Kamal of Egypt, spoke glowingly about the latter's Islamic faith and expressed admiration for the multiple daily prayer exercise of Muslims. The 15th century Hindu-Muslim mystic of Varanasi, Uttar Pradesh, India, Kabir Das, when he was asked about how he would prefer to be buried as a Hindu or as a Muslim, said that what is important is not whether one is Hindu or Muslim, but the quality of life one lives. The mystics are typically of inclusive pluralistic mindset toward religious diversity in society. Therefore, this paper will examine the inclusive religious pluralism theological mindset of several mystics, as well as the importance of inclusive religious pluralism mindset for today's interreligious dialogue and relations. It will also examine Jacques Dupuy's inclusive religious pluralism theology from an authentic Christian understanding of pluralism. Dupuy appropriately universalizes the understanding of Christ's divinity, as well as advocates an understanding and appreciation of the authenticity of other religions, such that the commonalities of all religions are celebrated and the differences are respected and appreciated. This paper will demonstrate the viability of inclusive religious pluralism in other world religions like Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism from the lenses of mystics in those traditions. From a theological perspective, inclusive religious pluralism is an attempt to promote religious inclusive pluralism with fully grounded religious and theological presuppositions. Mystics generally affirm the divine or ultimate origin of all religions. Hence, for mystics, the Euro pluralism is the takeoff point in the assessment of religions in society. Some critics of Jalaluddin Rumi dismissed him as a universalist because they dismiss him as a universalist because he does not demand that Islam must be the only or primary locus of operation for his followers, and he approves of the spiritual value of other religions in society. Therefore, inclusive religious pluralism draws from the fundamental presupposition that the divine is at the heart of all religions, especially the theistic religions. Inclusive religious pluralism calls for every religious tradition to find within its teaching and worldview how and why other religions are both honorable and authentic. Therefore, an Islamic inclusive religious pluralism will have very strong Islamic nuance, just as inclusive pluralism in Judaism or Hinduism will have nuances peculiar to Judaism or Hinduism, respectively. Imperatively, this work recognizes that inclusive religious pluralism is not an exclusive Christian worldview. It is a theological presupposition and worldview that can legitimately crest in the ambiances of most of the world religions today. The summary of Jacques Dupuy's inclusive religious pluralism. In Christian theological landscape, Jacques Dupuy made the concept of inclusive religious pluralism popular in his seminal work of 1997, Toward the Christian Theology of Religious Pluralism. Dupuy's overriding arguments for inclusive pluralism is founded on a theology of Trinitarian Christology, which validates the active mystical presence of Christ in every religion that subscribes to belief in ultimate reality of God. At the heart of Dupuy's inclusive religious pluralism is the intent to show how the affirmation of Christian identity is compatible with a genuine recognition of the identity of other faith communities as representing in their own rights distinct facets of the self-disclosure of the absolute mystery in a single, unitary, but complex and articulated divine economy. What Dupuy does is to explore and demonstrate how inclusive religious pluralism is acceptable to a Christian. He is not recommending his Christocentric model of inclusive pluralism for people of non-Christian faith tradition, and I need to make this very clear, because people oftentimes misunderstand Dupuy on this perspective. Nonetheless, Dupuy provides the scholars of theology of religions an openness and theological framework which every faith community may adopt with their theology of inclusivity, but with very firm pluralistic foundation and outlook. What Dupuy successfully accomplished in Christian theology of religion is to produce a healthy blend of the positive features of inclusivism and pluralism, a theological hybridity which is very amenable to the 21st century world, where cultural and religious pluralism are socially normative. This normativity is what Mark Esheim measuredly articulates when he said, as a response to the spiritual and intellectual challenge of religious diversity, theologies of religious pluralism has become the interest of a much wider constituency, in addition to its application in mission or informal interreligious dialogue. It is of increasing relevance for those living in pluralistic social environments, unquote. Inclusive pluralism, as the word suggests, is a disposition where one holds other religions in esteem. And opens one's world for the other in a meaningful and fulfilling way. The other is appreciated and treated as a positive extension of oneself while honoring and dignifying the autonomy of that same other. With the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church fully embraced inclusivism as her new theology of religion model, which explains the universal salvific impact of Christ, but with the assumption that the Catholic Church remains the pinnacle for all humanity, an ideal abode for all God's children. This new theological model, although it rejects the old mantra, extra ecclesia nulla salus, therefore, this theological model of human beings, the theological model of the Second Vatican Council is that human beings can be saved in Christ, even if they exist outside the physical boundaries of the church. Now, Jacques Dupuy took the inclusive theology of the Catholic Church to another height, namely inclusive pluralism. Although the Catholic Church rejected through Vatican II documents our previous exclusivist stand and embraced inclusivism, the Church manifests and expressed understanding of religious pluralism is more of a de facto reality than a de jure of divine relationship with all of humanity. So Dupuy, by adopting and advocating the theology of inclusive religious pluralism, strongly affirms that religious pluralism is not just a de facto reality, but more importantly, a de jure of divine human relationship, thus affirming that it is God who willed the existence of multiple religions in human society. He defended the theology of inclusive religious pluralism from Christian perspective of the Trinity and Christology. So at the heart of Dupuy's concept of inclusive pluralism is the theological assumption that the man Jesus unquestionably belongs to the order of signs and symbols, but in him who has been constituted Lord and Christ. Acts chapter 2, verse 30 says, God's saving action reaches out to people in various ways, knowingly to some and to others unknowing. So to paraphrase his theology of inclusive pluralism in simple terms, Dupuy is saying that if Christ is God, which is a core doctrine of mainline Christianity, the second person of the Trinity, then Christ is part of the religious life and experience of any and all who believe in God. And that's a simplified way to express Dupuy. Now, I would like to look at the interreligious relations cues from select mystics, beginning with Anthony de Mello. However, followers of mystical traditions or people influenced by the spiritual propensity of mystical traditions see religious diversity as an asset to a society rather than a burden. This is because they see diverse religious traditions as enrichment to the spiritual tapestry of a society. Most major religious traditions of the world are endowed with mystical traditions, which while uniquely defined by the beliefs and teachings and rituals of such religions, are not constrained from appreciating the richness and values associated with other religious traditions. Although Oriental religions by design gravitate towards mysticism, as the previous colleague had brought to our awareness, other religions like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism honor and appreciate mystical practices in their traditions. Below are a select few, and I want to start with Anthony de Mello. Anthony was an Indian Jesuit priest who became renowned for integrating his Christian faith and spirituality with Buddhist and Taoist spirituality. He's credited to have published numerous books on spirituality, consisting of prayer, contemplation, and mediation. He commanded a global notoriety on the subject of synthesis of Oriental and Western spirituality. That some of the books published on that subject credited to him were not actually the product of his penmanship. 11 years after his death, the Vatican Office Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published a notification that raises concern about the Christian orthodoxy of some ideas in some works purported to have been written by de Mello. And not to stress that much further, but the point Mello makes is that there is a blend, there's a way to blend the Christian spirituality with the Eastern traditions, and that God exists in all equally. The other mystic I would like to highlight is Jalaluddin Rumi. He's a 13th century Sufi poet who is often described as a poet who spoke to everyone regardless of their religion. According to an article published in the New Yorker, Rumi is often described as the best-selling poet in the United States. He's typically referred to as a mystic, a saint, a Sufi, and an enlightened man. Curiously, however, this is the paper saying, although he was a lifelong scholar of the Quran and Islam, he is less frequently described as a Muslim. But it shows you the weak, poor understanding of the journalist who wrote this article. Because when someone is called a Sufi, you should know he's a Muslim. You don't have to emphasize he's a Muslim because people tend to have their interpretation of what they understand as Muslim. Now, Rumi was born in the early 13th century in what is now Afghanistan. He later settled in Konya in present-day Turkey with his family. His father was a preacher and a religious scholar who introduced Rumi to Sufism. Rumi continues his theological education in Syria, where he studied more traditional legal codes of Sunni Islam and later returned to Konya as a seminary teacher. For Rumi, devotion is a search for oneness with God. This resonates strongly with one of the 7 goals of Sufism. Among the admirers and followers of Rumi from his days as a teacher are Christians, Jews, and Sunni leaders and theologians. He called for a religion of love, which transcends all faith. He's an ideal mentor for Muslims to engage in interreligious dialogue and relationship with people of other faith traditions. Rumi's theological pedigree is a great model of inclusive religious pluralism from an Islamic perspective. He underscored the commonality among religions, especially Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as he applied theological ideas, values, and principles associated with all 3 religions. His teachings and views of life are valuable fulcrums and hinges for understanding, appreciation, and accommodation of religious differences and promotions of similarity.
Excuse me, Dr. Iwuchukwu. I know you have 2 more examples you'd like to tell us about. Perhaps we can get to them in the question and answer period, but could you please move to your conclusion?
Okay, how many minutes do I have? Am I running out?
Yeah, you're running out. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Well, the 2 others are, one is a Hindu mystic, a woman, Anamanda Mai Ma, and the 4th is a Jewish mystic, Abraham Cook. I would like to take you to the conclusion. So mystic generally call us toward a sense of true life and the need to seek union with the ultimate reality, regardless of what name is associated with the one. Typically, mystics honor and reverence the purity and essence of all religions. They are able to relate and genuinely appreciate the pure and holy in every religion. Religious people of different traditions should seek to emulate the mystics in their respect, honor, and appreciation of other faith traditions. Mystics have followers often beyond their own religious traditions. This is because people of all religious traditions are able to see through the pure spiritual quality of mystics, the spiritual fervency present in every religion. And finally, I would like to end with a quote from Abraham Cook, Rabbi Abraham Cook. All our endeavors must be directed toward disclosing the light of general harmony, which derives not from suppressing any power, any thought, any tendency, but by bringing each of them within the vast ocean of light infinite, where all things find their unity, where all is ennobled, all is exalted, and all is hallowed. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry for going beyond my time.
No, that was wonderful. What an uplifting quote to finish with. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh.
We will turn now to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Dr. Muhammad Akhtar Saeed Siddiqi. And according to the title of his talk, he will be demystifying a mystical tradition in Islam and its potential impact on global cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Go ahead, Dr. Siddiqi.
Could you stop sharing your screen? Okay.
Hello. Are you listening me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah. My entire praise is devoted to God Almighty, the sole sovereign of and merciful power over the domains of the entire cosmos. The blessings and peace towards all his prophets, the divine assignees, and their true followers until the day of resurrection. First of all, let me say a few words about the title of my presentation. The fusion or merger which I am to discuss now is of the two different entities. Number one, observation of natural phenomena. It would be called as OMP. And number two, comprehension of sacred texts. It would be called as CST. The process of fusion or its outcome would be called a meaning fusion. It is a new term which I had to coin, and perhaps first time is being used in my paper. I have divided my paper as well as this presentation into 7 sections. Introduction, a perspective for the fusion of OMP and CST, meaning fusion of the two diverse entities of OMP and CST, generation of rational moral function, RMF, self-experience of the process of meaning fusion through a focused study of a full surah of Quran, the potential impact of this approach, and in the last section, summary and conclusions. Beside mentioning the last 3 points, I have in the very beginning have clarified that my paper is a part of my larger project of remodeling the paradigm of religious learning in Islam. I have already proposed 3 years ago a three-dimensional paradigm for religious inference and decision-making as an alternate paradigm to the conventional paradigm of the contemporary learning of Islam. In the last conference on the theme of delegitimization of violence in sacred and human context, I have presented it as a paper that has now been published. Let us now first see the figure of conventional paradigm of Islamic learning. It is a one-dimensional paradigm of God's decree and human compliance. The commands are delivered to man, to humankind, ready-made, and compliance is demanded on the part of human being. Now, let us to my proposed three-dimensional paradigm of religious learning. The cosmos, the human cognition, and the sacred texts are horizontally connected and have a direct link to God. The fusion under discussion is a subset of this three-dimensional paradigm of religious learning. In the second section of my paper, I have attempted to give the readers a perspective for the study of fusion. No cognitive activity can take place without a worldview or Weltanschauung. Likewise, a pre-existed schema of the brain is also needed for processing of any information. Similarly, out of various types of mindset, a specific type of mindset would also be needed. The details of the theories of Weltanschauung and brain schema could be found in contemporary literature of hermeneutics and cognitive science. Avoiding these details, I have assumed for the purpose of my paper an ideal situation of the individual involved as pre-existed and have given a brief narrative of Weltanschauung schema of the brain and the required mindset for the proposed fusion. It is a brief description of Weltanschauung as a case in an ideal situation. Humanity has been naturally equipped and honored with cognitive capabilities and with a natural instinct to differentiate between good and bad, and is therefore destined in this world of trial to attempt to develop human knowledge and applied ethics, and then to transform the both into actual practice. The resultant knowledge and ethics will never be immune from human error and falsification, and hence will always be subject to review and improvement. The sacred texts of the prophets, along with their historical context, are an additional and supplementary help available to the entire humanity as a manifest phenomena of God's immense mercy to provide instant guidance time to time. In order to award corresponding rewards and punishment on the individual performance of every cognizant human being, another phase of human life after the termination of the present trial period is also an integral part of the overall Islamic Weltanschauung in its ideally required form. The schema theory is also considered as pre-existed before any intellectual action in the mind. Likewise, mindset might be of different types. So I have proposed that a particular mindset is required for the action of fusion. The third section is actually the main and central section of my paper. It explains how a fusion does take place between the two apparently heterogeneous entities of ONP and CST. This section elaborates the specific syntactic mode of the text of Holy Quran in the form of a first-person speech from the macrocosm of natural phenomena addressed to its microcosm, human being. And during this speech of the microcosm, it is often pointed out that the feature of its own often points to the feature of its natural phenomena. Hence, the NP and ST becomes aligned, and the ONP and CST become homogeneous. Another important feature of the Quranic text is that it is based on non-dictatorial style. Always the readers are invited to contemplate over the evidences and lessons provided by ONP. This style provokes the mind to look critically at surrounding religious social situation. If we analyze the content of the resultant fusion of ONP and CST, we would find that it is either tazkir or tazakkur. Tazkir means reminding from the side of macrocosm, and tazakkur means remembrance and reflection from the side of microcosm, the human being. The aggregate of the tazkir and tazakkur could also be placed in three major categories. Tazkir bi-ayatillah, reminding and contemplation through ONP. Tazkir bi-alaillah, reminding and contemplation through wonders, blessing and favors of God on the entire humankind. And tazkir bi-ayyamillah, reminding and contemplation through the annals and anecdotes from the days of God. In the fourth section, I have highlighted as to how the fusion of ONP and CST in the cognitive processing of human mind generates RMF, rational moral function. And it grows when moves to horizontal line, takes shape, and develops into human knowledge of ilmul aqaid or ilmul sharia. Where it grows through vertical line, it takes shape and grows, developing the structure of ibadat, ritual performances, and spiritual methods, suluk, tariqat, or tasawwuf. In the fifth section, I have incorporated the translation of Surah Al-Ra'd, 13th chapter of the Holy Quran, as an organic unit of the sacred text. I have to skip this section in this presentation due to time limitation. But in my paper, I have invited my readers to go through this experience. And after this experience, they will themselves feel that how the action of fusion takes place. In the sixth section, I have highlighted the potential impact of this approach. First, it converts the state of human mind from the mode of just receiving the information passively in a dogmatic manner to the mode of actively participating in a real process of seeking the truth and to be gradually closer to the ultimate reality. Second, it creates a kind of moral skill as well as a strong moral will into the mind of the individual. Both of them gradually develop in the mind of the same individual. In fact, the bane of most of the human societies in the past has been a bifurcation of the moral skill and moral will into two different classes of people. The concentration of power in a particular class to dictate others, along with a garb of sacredness, makes them corrupt at source, even in respect of morality they advocate for. The class of the followers who, though have enough strong moral will, but lacking in moral skill, along with an influencing dogmatic hold on their mind, cause them to become a tool of widespread wilderness and blind emotional atmosphere in human society. The bifurcation of moral skill and moral will and their concentration into two different classes was the result of a paradigm shift that happened during the dominance of one-dimensional conventional paradigm of religious learning started to develop during the medieval ages of Muslim history. Ulama and shuyukh were regarded as the expert of mutun, while the others regarded as muqallidun, mere followers. The first are assumed to have moral skill, where the others are expected to have only a strong moral will. The third significant feature of the expected impact of this approach of meaning fusion, if it is publicly accepted, would be an ownership of religious inference and decision-making from the shoulders of the present text scholars to the social scientists, who should have possessed equal insight into the sacred text, with only difference of not having any sacred status in the society for themselves. In the last section, I have summarized the whole paper and mentioned conclusions. Whereas the natural phenomena as well as the sacred texts are believed to be ordained by divine decree, the exercise of human endurance in comprehending and interpreting the text as well as the human act of systematic observation creates a real human knowledge along with a moral consciousness. In the operation of the fusion, if the operation of the fusion could be analyzed, two prominent components would be found operating. Tazkir, indicating, reminding, alerting, warning, revoking, or motivating to discover certain facts through the joint operation of ONP and CST being addressed from the side of macrocosm, and tazakkur, reflection and contemplation on the part of microcosm, the human being, leading to be alert, careful, conscious, and intellectually alert. Tazkir plus tazakkur might be divided into three categories. The meaning fusion through its both components of tazkir and tazakkur should generate in the participating individual a viable and transcendental rational moral state of mind that is supposed to be centrally based on a conscious love as natural consequence of the feeling of gratitude from the side of human being to God, the creator, nourisher, and sustainer of the cosmos. This state of mind, or in other words, an invisible vertical relationship between a subject and God, later adopted in Muslim history with various names such as Tazkiyat Nufus, purification of souls, Suluk, adopting a mental path, Tariqa, a method, or Tasawwuf, mysticism. As to the horizontal side, that includes a relationship between individual versus individual or individual versus community, the state of mind mentioned above generates a critical and innovating mindset, produce a developing amount of human knowledge and ethics. Lastly, the paper specifically mentions 4 significant potential impacts of the meaning fusion approach: converting the state of human mind from the mode of just passively receiving, it converts to actively functioning in seeking the truth, as well as to be close gradually to the ultimate reality, combining the moral skill and moral will into the mind of the individual, gradual ownership from the shoulders of merely text scholars to the social scientists, and developing an atmosphere of la ikraha fid deen, no compulsion in religious matters, even in Muslim regions of the world, which was the original message of the Holy Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's teaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Siddiqi. Thank you. And so thank you to all 3 of our presenters. We now have about 20 minutes for some Q&A period. And so I will try to keep my eye on the whole screen here. And if you could, well, one way we could do this would be to put up your hand through the reactions button. You can raise your hand and I'll try to find those who are raising their hand with a question or comment. You could also put things in the chat if you like. So do we have some questions for our speakers? I see Barbara Pemberton has a question.
No, I just want to say kudos to the 8-year-old grandchild who did those slides.
Yes.
Kudos.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Very good. Linda Ceriello.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, thank you. My question is for the second speaker, Dr. Iwuchukwu.
Yeah.
Addressing your the conference theme in general makes me think of students of mine who often struggle to understand how theistic and atheistic paths can be seen as pointing to an ultimate oneness. And so I was thinking about your mentioning Dupuy validating the active mystical presence of Christ in every religion with the qualification religion that subscribes to belief in ultimate reality of God. And whether, I don't know if putting De Mello in conversation would shed more light on how, just helping my students think through that understanding of how an ultimate oneness can be inflected, for example, through the Catholic Church, embracing an inclusivity if it's mandatory to conceive of it as anchored in saving through Christ.
Yeah.
So, under comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I try to make the point here that, and this is the theological point Dupuy is making from a Christian perspective. Christians believe that Jesus is Christ. I'm sorry, Jesus is God, the second person of the Trinity. And therefore, by his ontological identity, he is part of everything that associates with the one God. And so wherever God is mentioned, he is invariably part of that conversation, whether you know it or not. Now, it was his way to help Christians broaden their horizon and our understanding of God's magnitude and God's global, universal interaction with all God's creatures. So that, in fact, in the minds of Dupuy and a number of scholars, Christianity cannot exhaust Christ. And Christianity is not Christ. Christianity is not equal to Christ. Christ is broader than the church, broader than Christianity, is all encompassing. And the point I'm trying to make here is that other religions can draw from that theological strain to include other, Islam does it already. Islam believes that all religions emanate from God. We as Christians are struggling with that concept, you know, the Ure religious pluralism. 2018, I think it was, or 2019, the Pope made an amazing concession, speaking with the imam from the imam from Egypt, that all religions come from God, which is a mind-blowing admission of a Christian leader, which we haven't heard in the past. So the point here is that a Hindu, it's easy for a Hindu to understand that other religions come from the same essence. You know, you talk about the Brahmin. And Jews can also, from the concept of the one God, who is the creator, you know, later Judaism figured out that the God of Israel is also the God of the Lebanese, is the God of their neighbors. It wasn't just a God for the Jews alone. So that we can develop this inclusive mentality, inclusive religious mentality that is beyond just inclusivism. Because the Christian inclusivism, some people describe it as a colonial mentality where we think we are superior and everybody has to be like us. But there's something to go with that versus our old mentality of exclusivism, where we think that only Christians go to heaven. So the inclusive pluralistic perspective honors our diversity and encourages our commonalities, you know, so we can use the things that we find common among ourselves and appreciate them, as well as respect those things that make us uniquely different, not to castigate them or demean them like we would sometimes typically do. So I would say to the young folks to be broader in understanding that God is bigger than our minds. God is bigger than our individual religions. In fact, I try to make the point here that religion is a means to an end, not the end in itself, which is contrary to some people thinking that one religion is an end. And I think as a theologian, I would object to that.
Good. I see that Zakia has her hand up.
Okay.
Amen to what you said, Dr. Iwuchukwu. So, yes, my query is to Dr. Lidke, Jeffrey Lidke. It was fascinating what you said, because in my journey to the mystical realm, and as a non-academic, actually that turned me to the academic world to study, go deeply into other faiths. And it just deepened my understanding of the Quran, which I wish the Muslims would do that. We are all Muslims and Christians and Jews, I believe, we are all stuck in the worship aspect, completely missing the point of just what Dr. Iwuchukwu said, that the absolutely universal level. So Dr. Lidke, what I found is when I studied the Eastern traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism, I realized the truth of what God says in the Quran, that I created all those religions. They're all from me. So know them to understand, to know them to understand me. And I felt that my knowledge of mysticism would never have been complete. Well, it's still not complete. Oh my God, not at all. But anyway, it gave me such insight. Buddhism, Hinduism gave me such insight, especially the awakening aspect of Buddha, and the concept like Indra's net in Hinduism to Islam. And I also feel very, very, very troubled by the Western's use of Sufism as an extra thing. No, it's not. It's the ultimate esoteric culmination of Islam. As every faith tradition has a culmination to it. Why should it be a separate term used? It's almost like some Muslims are embarrassed to say I'm a Muslim. They say, I'm a Sufi. So I can say I'm trying to be a Muslim. I can say I'm trying to be a Sufi, because even the Muslim term is used as in the Quran as anybody who is submitted to God, whether from whatever faith tradition they're coming. And I'm sure majority of Muslims don't even understand that. So my question to you is this something you see in others, that the other traditions help them understand or go deeper into their own traditions?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you can come at this universalist and pluralist perspective, both from the lens of faith and also from the lens of science. And I really appreciate with the Dalai Lama that he's kind of offering that paradigm very much within his own Buddhist tradition, but also with a deep kind of sense of the legitimacy and truth that can be found in all the traditions. So of course, from his perspective, it would be Parama Buddha or Supreme Buddha, which manifested all of these traditions. But it's as if these are just different doorways into the same sacred palace. And I think very much, that we need to take this idea of the mystic activist educator seriously. These mystical traditions have, like the traditions of Shambhala, it's such a perfect metaphor that the Shambhala tradition was up there in the high Himalayas, sequestered, protected. There was no access to it. It was so limited. And then suddenly this deep fascination arises and these events transpire that bring it out into the world. And I think similarly, all of these mystical traditions, the very essence and heart of them, we have to find a way to disseminate and transmit them to people, because I really do think if children encounter these traditions, it's extraordinary what can happen. And I think the heart of this whole idea that God created everything and there's all a commonality lies in the heart of children, right? It doesn't matter whether you're African or Muslim or atheist or whatever you are. If you're a child, your heart is the home of God, and so that's really where I think this work has to unfold.
That's what Islam says, that look into your heart and you'll see. God is just a label because we live in the framework of creation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Who would like to ask the next question? I will exercise the moderator's prerogative, therefore, and I would observe that both Dr. Lidke and Dr. Siddiqi draw upon, or at least note, the use of science as an ally of mystical practice. That might come as a surprise to people who hold a conventional stereotype of these as opposed. And I'd like to invite either of you, Dr. Siddiqi or Dr. Lidke, if you'd like to speak to this in a more general way. Is this an important move for the future of mysticism, that there be this collaboration with scientific worldview and scientific approaches?
Well, I'll just hop in to start off. Certainly there can be a dark side to the wedding of mysticism and science. I tried to suggest that. And of course, these traditions have come into conflict, and you have to think about which science and which mysticism and which time period. But I definitely, particularly in the area of neuroscience, I think the potential is just remarkable for actually studying and trying to understand what contemplative practice does for us, how it benefits us, and the ability to translate that across sectarian divides, and even to translate that to folks who are not religious. I think that the potential there is great, and I'm hope, and assuming many of us are aware that they've done these kind of neurocognitive studies, not just on Buddhist practitioners, but also Christian and Muslim and others, and kind of the baseline is, yes, different practices seem to do different things and activate different parts of the body, but they seem to have in common that they all do good things for us. They make us better people, they heal us, they connect our brain in meaningful ways, and they generate typically pro-social behavior patterns. And so the degree to which that kind of information inspires people to take these practices seriously and integrate them into their lives, then I think the union of science with mysticism can be very fruitful.
Professor Siddiqui, I referred to you. I don't know if you would like to speak to that as well?
Yeah. As to the traditions of tasawwuf in Islam is concerned, I would say that philosophical thinking actually took refuge in the tasawwuf. And there were many Sufis which were philosophers as well. For example, Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi was the great philosopher. Generally, in the Sunni section of the Muslims, due to paradigm shift in the medieval period, philosophy has been wiped out. But in Shia theology or in some Sufis, there was a rationalism. So actually, as far Holy Quran is concerned, it invokes and it provokes philosophical thinking and rational thinking. And philosophical thinking and rational thinking is the basis of the scientific approach, which developed later and further nourished by the Western. So actually there is no conflict between the texts of Holy Quran and scientific approach, but I would like to say that Quran is specifically promotes a scientific thinking. Although in our history, we, due to paradigm shift, the exercise of rational thinking could not be developed as it should be.
Thank
I
you.
would like to comment on it, Dr. Siddiqi. What I actually commented on another session. Dr. Nasri, Syed Hussain Nasri, the Muslim scholar from Georgetown University, he said that the problem with the Western science since the Enlightenment was the problem, was that they took God out of the picture when they were developing science. And in Islamic science, God is at the center. So if any scientist keeps that in the center or keeps an open mind, let's put it this way, it will converge into that single reality of God, and everything will fall into place. Because there cannot be any conflict between science and mysticism, but the conflict comes with the enlightenment and the rationality, so to speak. And akal in Arabic also means fetters, chains. So we have to go into the heart to get into the right insight. I don't even know whether I'm making any sense. Maybe it's becoming too much of a mystical language. But anyway, I hope you get what I'm saying.
I think a related synergism to this is also in the medical areas, and as well as scientific and even food studies, how those dimensions relate to spirituality traditions in Africa, especially, certainly in China and other places. I want to thank all the presenters. Dr. Iwuchukwu, I very much appreciated your referencing Jacques Dupuy, who Bill Burroughs described as this transitional figure who miraculously stayed within the Catholic Church. But I just wanted to add a comment about Professor Dupuy, that one of the ways he was able to do that, which kind of goes to the question about how to educate and how to be a transitional person in these certain tensions with certain faith communities, is that he was really careful about pushing back against certain terms. For example, Dupuy was very hesitant and reticent to use words like inclusive and exclusive and pluralist even, because he artfully said these are not biblical terms. That leaves aside a whole host of other issues, but he was really trying to say that people shouldn't say more than what they're allowed to say, which was his way of launching people toward directions that they might not have otherwise been able to have permission to find themselves towards. So I appreciated that perspective, and I just wanted to add that thought.
Very good.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes, did you have a reply?
Oh, no, really. It's interesting when you hear, especially Christian scholars affirm Jacques Dupuy, because oftentimes people misunderstand him, and they do not understand. I mean, when you read Jacques Dupuy, the problem he had was the left thought he was not radical enough, and the right thought he was too radical. And so he found himself in a very uncomfortable middle. But he's helped us, as a scholar, he's helped me broaden my understanding of how my faith connects with the rest of humanity and the rest of religion. Especially not to idolize, not to turn religion into an idol, and, which we often do in our different sects.
To be criticized from both directions is a very uncomfortable place to be, but it might also suggest you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for your participation in this session, especially a thank you to our wonderful presenters. I would remind you that there is a evaluation form to fill out. One way to get to it is in the chat. There is a link over there in the chat that Patricia put in some time ago. You could click on that link for the evaluation. And our next panels begin at 4:30. So you have a bit of a break, and I hope to see you in another panel at 4:30. Thank you all.